Welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. Here's your host, Tom Bourne.
Hi, and welcome to Health and Safety Conversations. I'm your host, Tom Bourne, and with me today is the awesome Keith Johnon. Keith, how are you?
I'm well, Tom. Thanks for the invite and good to be here this afternoon.
It's always good to have hands-on health and safety professionals come on and tell their story. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started in safety and where you've been with your safety journey, seeing looks to be most of your career?
Yeah, I finished up in the Department of Defence in 2005, and I was an investigator with the military police. So I was trying to find a connection between undertaking investigations and what that looked like. And I looked into health and safety. I actually walked into mining after I walked out of the Department of Defence, and after a course of time, within a short space of time, I was into a health and safety role, and I guess in investigating crime and that sort of thing and investigating accidents sort of made sense. With the benefit of hindsight now, I can say that health and safety is a bit more broader than what you see just with accident investigations, that sort of thing. I spent a fair bit of time in some mining towns, both up in central Queensland, then in New Zealand, back in Brisbane and Perth. Then after a course of time, got out of mining, went into meat processing, that sort of thing, and then moved into construction, and now with infrastructure services. Sort of started as a safety advisor and then went into superintendent roles and then mining manager roles with safety, and then ended up with different managerial roles, and now I'm the regional safety manager for the infrastructure services within Fulton Hogan in Queensland.
Excellent, mate. Excellent. Covered a broad range of industries. Out of all those positions in safety, what's been the most challenging position you've had? And
I would say all of them had their challenges. The one I'd probably land on would be around construction and infrastructure services. But if I looked at the Department of Defence, for about 3 years, I was a recruit instructor there. An example would be I'd take recruits down and teach them how to fire rifles, those sorts of things. Young kids on a rifle range, operating weapons for the first time in their lives, and knowing the bullets come out the end, you're sort of in the conscious state a lot. You want to make sure that they're keeping their rifle down range, that sort of thing. Mining and quarrying. So mining I started out in when I got into safety, and I've been in quarrying now since I've been with Fulton Hogan, because that's a part of our business. Both underground and open cut, both of them have their complexities and their challenges. It's a continual moving environment. There's a lot of high risk, a lot of big plant, that sort of thing. So that was complex in itself. Meat processing, it's a bit, in my mind, it was a little mundane. It was a little quiet, but again, high risk. A lot of people have got knives, there's blades and all cutting implements, that sort of thing. But for me, I would say the construction and in particular infrastructure services business has been the more challenging that I've seen. And the other examples I gave around manufacturing and mining, that sort of thing, or even construction, they're normally boxed in, they're on a lease, they've got a fence around it or something like that. They're on a specific site and don't move. For the infrastructure services side, and what I do around asphalt laying, spray seal, that sort of thing, you're continually mobile, you're moving, particularly where the sites aren't static. And then you've got the problems with, in particular, the members of public. They'll get to your roadworks, they don't like being held up at the traffic, and you get things like the abuse of your traffic controllers and trying to deal with that. You don't know what influence the driver is under at the time. And we get a lot of offenders that'll drive through roadworks that are drunk, they're drugged, they're stealing a car, they're being chased by police, and all of that at that one time. You're trying to deal with that. You're not expecting it to occur. And some of the things you put in place, a simple stop slow bat, is not necessarily the answer. It's not going to stop a 2.5 ton car that's flying through sight at 100 kilometres an hour when it's meant to be 40k an hour. So that has been a challenge, that's for sure. Trying to understand what that looks like. Best practice would say, let's detour the traffic and don't have them come near us at all. But then you've got the clients who want to make sure that the traffic keeps rolling. So trying to deal with that, I guess.
Yeah, when you deal with the public, is it always in your back of your mind that you've got that lovely little provision which is reasonably practicable to deal with? Because, as you said, it's not like you can envisage everything that's going to happen once you add in the human factor.
Yeah, correct. So if I'm on a standard construction site, they might be building a bridge. Like I said, there might be a fence around it. Or if you're a visitor or you're a subcontractor coming on, you will sign in to be on site. You're isolated once you're in there. You're being directed because you're a subcontractor or a worker or whatever the case may be. But on roadworks, once you add in the member of public that's coming through, you have no say on what they can do. I can only hold a stop slow bat that says 40 kilometres an hour or stop, and it's virtually up to them whether they want to or not. So it's a difficult one, and it's evolving all the time. We're trying to come up with new initiatives on making it safe. But again, if it's might be a young kid who's high on drugs or whatever, if they want to put the pedal to the metal and fly through sight, they're going to do that. And our capacity to stop it is difficult. It's just telling our road workers to get out of the way.
Yeah, some local governments at least use those wonderful control methods of the police on specials. Quite an expensive exercise though. Ever used them?
We do use police, and more often than not, the police don't get out of the vehicle. And I can only speak from my experiences here in Queensland. I think if we had a bit more of a stakeholder engagement around what that looks like, there'd be better initiatives if we could see the police out of their vehicle and being a bit more proactive than some of the examples I've seen. And I won't go into that, they remain in their vehicle. But if they can be out on the job, then great. And there's been some other initiatives we're implementing now around the roadside behaviour monitoring system, which looks like a telephone box that's attached on top of a couple of excavator tracks. That's got a built-in speed camera on it with some signage. When the traffic seems to see that now, they're slowing down for that initiative. So that seems to be working. But yeah, for police, I think that just needs to be a bit more proactive from my perspective.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I certainly don't want to go down the path about that because, yeah, I don't think it's a positive thing that we can talk about publicly. All right, yeah, you've done lecturing at QUT. How did that come about?
I had a student that turned up to my workplace one day. He was a student for QUT, and she asked me if she could do some work placement with us. And back in about 2017, I think it was, students used to be able to do 200 hours with an employer as part of work placement for them, so they could understand what the workplace is really like, get an understanding and feel for how they would fit in, and then they could do some sort of research project as well. So that transpired, and then I ended up talking to the lecturer at the time that was there and said, look, I'm interested in doing some lecturing, particularly around accident investigations and emergency response, that sort of thing. That was a bit of a niche that I've been looking into and have had experience with. And the next thing you know, they said, yeah, look, come along. The more external people that have expertise they can bring in, that they seem to want to do, as opposed to just the lecturer of the faculty being the only lecturer to do the lectures. So it made sense. So yeah, since about 2017, been lecturing on the side at QUT, and it's a good opportunity to see the students. We get to impart some knowledge there. There's some good questions, and obviously there's something in it for me. There might be a student that's looking for work after the fact, and maybe Fulton Hogan might be their employer of choice.
Yeah, and you can cherry pick the best ones, right?
Absolutely, yes, and we do that.
Yeah, why wouldn't you? Yeah. All right, be police. Safety, all of it involves some sort of public speaking. A lot of people still don't feel comfortable in, even addressing like toolbox talks, pre-starts, etc. Do you have any tips for people who are starting out who now find themselves in a position, I don't know, they actually have to talk to people, how to do it and how to present them?
Look, it started out for me because I ended up being, well, actually I studied speech and drama at school. I liked acting, so maybe that was where it kicked off. But then I joined the Army, and after about 4 or 5 years, I ended up being a recruit instructor, like I said, and I spent 3 years at the 1st Recruit Training Battalion. So just about every day I was standing in front of some young kid, albeit I was only 24, 25 at the time, and they were normally 18, 19, and I'd either giving a drill lesson or teaching them weaponry or how to navigate out in the field, that sort of thing. So standing up in front of them and talking just became part and parcel of what I did. I have seen examples over the years of, did see some instructors who were a bit nervous, and they used to stand in front of a tree and they would yell at the tree, and that seemed to give them a sense of comfort of how it should work, or confidence, that sort of thing. Other examples, I've seen people, they had rehearsed their notes that they had, and they might do 5 or 6 run-throughs, dry run-throughs, may even talk in front of the mirror. Secondly, I think back to my speech and drama days, and I'd rehearse the notes that I have, and then I'd have someone sitting across from me who was being the other actor, and that was another way that I could practice doing what I do. Similarly, if I've got to go and give a presentation, and I'm doing them all the time now at different conferences, then I might give it to the family before I go so they can give me some constructive criticism. And and then away we go. But what I do find that after the first couple of minutes, once you're out on stage, the butterflies have gone, and then you try and interact with the crowd and bring them in and get them in on the joke, and then away we go.
Yeah, no, yeah. It took me 2 years to actually become comfortable with it, but yeah, once you're there, you're there. All right, let's talk legislation, because it's important in safety to a degree. Legislation. We seem to be going down the path in Australia of tougher and tougher legislations, harsher and harsher penalties for breaching safety acts and regulations. Does that actually make a difference in the day-to-day decision-making of businesses?
I think in some regards, it's dependent on the size of the company and what resources they have. So the bigger the company, then the better informed they might be. And an example I might give was a couple of years ago, I went to a mining conference here in Brisbane, and the head prosecutor from the Queensland government for health and safety stood up there, and he talked about his hit rate for prosecutions, and he said it was a 95%. And in my mind, being part ex-prosecutor as well in military police, you would know whether you're going to win a case pretty much or not. And in my mind, it was either he was bragging about his 95%, or he was putting people on notice to say, if I'm going to charge you, then I'm going to win. So I had the capacity and ability to go to that conference because the company wanted to pay, and then I'm able to go back to the management team and then feed that information back to them and say, well, this is his hit rate, these are the things he's looking at, and we are put on notice. But the smaller companies who don't have the resources nor the capacity, the finances to fund things on the side, probably don't see those things or are remiss of it. And then as a result, they just run the gauntlet and they get what they get. The other side would be, it's the culture of the company and whether they care. And the example I'd give would be, I think it was back in about 2012, Peter Colbert down in Adelaide. He was the owner of the trucking company. And prior to the fatality on the day it occurred, he'd been told by the truck drivers that the brakes on this truck, they're faulty and they need to be fixed. And he was the director of the company, and he just decided not to do anything. And then on that fateful day, the driver drove the truck, and then he ran into the power pole, and unfortunately he died. And then Peter Colbert, the director of the company, he was sent off to jail, and he got 12 years imprisonment. So either you got to take that care factor into it. Do you care or don't you? And there's a prime example of, if you don't care, well, the end result is someone could die, and then you as the director ends up in jail.
Yeah. Industrial manslaughter, a lot of publicity as it comes about in states and territories. Huge penalties. Do you think, apart from the initial shock factor, it's actually made any difference? Because I've noticed since 2018, that's when it first started to rear its head. 2018, the actual number of deaths in the workplace across Australia has actually gone up. It hasn't gone down.
In my mind, I was never a fan of industrial manslaughter. I thought that the criminal justice system as it stood at the time was effective and could do things it could make an impact still. And I think once we got on, as in the states and territories, got on the bandwagon of industrial manslaughter, then every other state and territory said, well, don't leave me behind, we need to get involved because that's the end thing. But I've read a couple of books and different blogs, that sort of thing, and particularly with Greg Smith, the lawyer over at WA, and his commentary has been quite good about what he's seen. At the moment, there's no real evidence to suggest that industrial manslaughter produces any safer outcomes, and I would agree with that. And when they had the reasoning as to why they were going to introduce it, they never said it was about improving health and safety. It was all the other reasons. We just want to hold people accountable at the end of the day. We know it disproportionately targets small business owners, and I've seen that here in Queensland, that the people that are actually on the gear are the directors, like the forklift operator is the director of the company, and that's the person who ends up getting punished. So it is targeting small business, and I don't think that was ever the intent. That's just been the byproduct of what comes out, and it limits and dismisses our opportunities for learning. Because once it occurs, most bigger companies will just go for a legal privilege. They're not going to say anything. They only have to hand over what happened pre as opposed to post. They won't get into the court system for 3 or 4 years. And by that time, everyone's forgotten the topic. And then they'll probably go in and likely plead guilty anyway. So there's no real case to answer. It's just, oh, here's your fine, and then away you go. Or unless they get some form of imprisonment, if that's what it's going to be. So think we got lost in the weeds about what was the intent of industrial manslaughter. It's probably that, workers imagine, workers done thing for what I see. We imagine one thing and the byproduct of what we got was not what we intended to get.
Yeah. Do you think there's a better way rather than just throwing people in jail?
I like the intent of the enforceable undertakings. I think if we can get into a scenario where if we have an accident on site and there's going to be some form of stakeholder engagement between the parties, and then they can put their hand up and go, yes, you got us, we didn't do the right thing, and perhaps they implement some form of training that they've got to do. Perhaps they've got to do a research project through a university around that matter that they dealt with. I think that adds more value to the end user and to industries as well, as opposed to just smacking the end user and saying, well, don't do it again. Not sure that provides a lot of solace to the families that have lost loved ones. How do you get them in on the journey? That's another thing. And there's been examples around where they have different legislation that's named after a loved one. An example is like Jet's Law, the young kid who was killed by a driver that had an epileptic fit and hadn't been taking his medication. So Jet's Law then came in and said, well, if you have an epileptic fit, then certain things need to be done through your medical provider. You may lose your license for a period of time, etc. So is that another thing that could be done? Maybe there's some avenues that could be different to, or as opposed to, industrial manslaughter.
Yeah, look, I've been trying to give that a bit of thought myself. I kind of think if we also get the people who are involved to do some sort of, I know it sounds weird, public speaking or public awareness campaign about the situation and what could have been done, what should have been done, and then, include things like, I don't know, having to make the call, how they felt when they had to make the call to the family and involved and stuff like that. I think there's better ways to change public opinion than the 5 minutes of press and then everyone forgets. But as you said, I'm not sure if that actually satisfies families' concerns at this stage.
Oh, I think it's got some merit, Tom. We've had accidents in our workplace that are not fatalities, and the worker involved may have said, oh, look, I made an error of judgment, and not to say that we point the finger at the human, but they've been prepared to stand up in front of a group, do a toolbox talk and say, oh, look, this is how this transpired. This is what we could have done better, and these are the opportunities for improvement. So, yeah, I'd agree. There's some merit in that.
Cool. All right, fly in and fly out. You would have done this many times, I'd suggest.
Yes.
How do you feel about it?
Personally, I didn't have too many issues with FIFO. I did FIFO out of South Australia, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory at different mine sites. It's double-edged sword. Depending on what the roster's like, you've got an even time roster, particularly if you're in the mining sector up in the Bowen Basin in central Queensland, they're even time. So that's not so bad. You might get your 7 on, 7 off. That looks okay, but you go to some of the iron ore sites that we've got, some of them can be 2 and 1 or 3 and 1, and it's a long time to be away from home. So roster and location can be a significant factor there. If you're working on a remote site like Cockatoo Island, which is off Western Australia, you might know of.
Yep.
If you've just had enough and said, well, I'm leaving, well, you can't just drive off site. There's a big pool of water between Cockatoo Island and the Australian region itself. So what does that mean? There are obviously the downsides with it. There's obviously the isolation that comes with it, and that can be pretty taxing psychologically. You're away from the family, and you can do the Zoom or the Teams call or FaceTime or whatever it might be, but you're not with loved ones, so to speak. Finding a hobby, I like going to the gym, so that was one for me. I do a bit of study, so I could do some study after hours, but some people just got stuck in a rut and they ended up in the boozer, and it was 10 before 10, so 10 drinks before 10 o'clock, so that they were partly sober before they went to work the next morning. But I don't mind a drink every now and again, but I'm not sure that the answer is in the bottom of the bottle. So when you're doing FIFO, so that's my thoughts on FIFO.
Yeah. Do you think that apart from the roster, the camp you're staying at, the accommodation and the conditions there have a lot to do with whether you're going to last the distance, whether it's actually good for your mental health or not?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I've had examples where you would hot bunk your rooms. So on your days off, you'd have someone else come into your room, and then they'd stay in your room for the period you're away, and you were just sharing that room. But That had its disadvantages. Again, when you're super isolated, if you're on, again, the size, most mine sites I went to were quite large, 300 to 400 people, if not more. But those that are only small, where you've got about 100, then you're going to have a limited gym, you're going to have a small boozer. The mess has probably only got the one cook, so the variety of food isn't always that great. Again, you're remote. Another sticking point is if your access in and out of site is via a plane, and you've only got a dirt tarmac, that can be problematic, particularly when it rains, because the plane will just say, oh, I can't land because I'm going to get bogged. So you just end up remaining on site until the tarmac's dried out and the plane can get in. And if you've only got 5 days off, you might end up only having 3 days at home. So you've got to consider that as well, and that's an issue.
Yeah. All right, take fives. Fan or not?
Look, I think they have their place. When I first saw take fives 15 years ago, I guess it was, back in mining, it was, this is the product, here's your booklet, you've got to do 2 a day. So it was more around quantity than quality. And I'd see people in the crib hut, on their crib breaks, and they'd be filling them in there whilst they're eating their lunch, because they know at the end of shift they've got to hand their supervisor 2 take fives or 2 BMA safes or whatever they're going to be, and that's it. But in my mind, I see that they're just a tick and flick mentality. And I was reading a coroner's inquest the other day for the case of Adams and Watkins in 2007. This was a Unimap machine, which is like a locomotive that fixes up train tracks, that sort of thing. And these chaps were working on this train, and it was out the back of Mackay in central Queensland, and they died as a result of this accident that had occurred. And then when the inspector came through, or the regulator investigated, like their pre-start, that sort of thing, they noticed that, and from their conversations with different people, that when they would do the pre-start on the machine, they'd look at specific items around lubrication and brakes, because they're critical, but everything else was just ticked off to say as though it's been done. So it was that tick and flick mentality. But what the coroner came back with, he just said, look, over time, it eroded the assurance that was intended to be provided by that checklist. In my mind, I think the take five can be the same thing. So if you're going to implement it, it's got to be for the right reasons. You're trying to get quantity as opposed to quality. How do you do it? So you've got some sort of buddy system, so it makes sense. And if it's seen only as a measure of activity, because it's a quantity thing, because you want the numbers, then you're not providing any insight into the effectiveness of your safety management system. So if you're going to implement it, then have some sort of robust measure on how you're going to do it. Can you have a buddy system? You do it in groups, that sort of thing, as opposed to just I want 2 at the end of the day, because that doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree. Quality, and if you don't actually check them, if you don't actually look at the take fives that people have filled out and seeing if they're actually filling them out correct, I would say there's 0 point in them. Absolutely. And it always baffles me when companies say you've got to fill out X amount per day or X amount per week. I mean, where does this figure come from? I just magically dreamt it up, perhaps.
Oh, and that could well be the case. And I think Greg Smith did a podcast with Rob Long once, and he said he was on a mine site, and the admin had counted over 8,000 take fives for a month for the mine that they were at. Most of them were filled out incorrectly, but no one had ever brought up the fact that they'd been compiled incorrectly, and it was just they were put into a database, and this was the trending analysis at the end of the month, and that was it. But yeah, it didn't add any value to the end user whatsoever. It was just a tick and flick, capture information for trending data, and that was about it.
Yeah. All right. While we're on looking about safety metrics, etc., risk matrices. Tell me your opinion on risk matrices and their value.
The risk matrix can make sense, but I think they're too subjective. Now, what you might think is low, others might perceive as being medium. You might have companies that are chasing a statistic around, they want a number of high risk incidents per month so they can show that they're being tracked. If I went back many years ago, there was when we had the floods up in the Bowen Basin, I think it was about 2008, and they found some things had been occurring around OH&S, and the regulator got capture of a couple of JSAs that had been compiled and realised that there was a bit of nonsense going on with the way that they were filled out. And it said that if you had a high risk on your RAM, your risk assessment matrix, you had to go to the project manager. So no one wanted to go and bother the project manager, so then they just stymie it and put it in as a low, and that way the supervisor could sign off on the JSA, and away they went. And the regulator came back and said, do you really need to have a risk matrix at all? Can we just get rid of it? You just say, this is the hazard, this is the control, and away we go. In my mind, if we went down that path, I don't see it as being poor, but if you're going to have a risk assessment matrix, then you need to understand how it works and make it so it's not as subjective as it is, where all people are on board, they understand what the criteria is, and don't get lost in the weeds on what's the difference between low and high and severity, consequence, those sorts of things, or likelihood. But yeah, that would be my thoughts on the RAM.
Yeah. Just on that, what's your opinion of the workers who are actually at literally the coalface? Do they see any of these safety procedures like JSAs, JHAs, take fives? Are they seeing them as valuable, or are they seeing them as just pain in the neck procedures or things they actually have to do before they start their real work?
I think they perceive them as a pain in the neck, and the example I'd give is, I'll see supervisors say to their workers, "I'll make sure you're signed onto the JSA, or make sure you're signed onto your safe work method statement." It's not make sure you've read and understood what's required there, and then authenticate that that's the case by signing off on it. I think we just get stuck in a rut where we develop these things and it's out there in the ether, and then it's just another thing that we've got to sign. They don't read it. They don't want to read it. They're not really interested. It's just, let's get on with the job. So again, that's probably the workers imagined and workers done. So those of us who sit in the glossy head offices, that sort of thing, that are making up these procedures and everything else, are vastly different to how the workers go and do it out in the field. And that's the challenge I think we have. If you're going to go and make a swim, you need to get cross-section of your workforce involved. You need to get out there onto the coalface, and you need to be with the workers and then challenge that safe work method statement that you've got, because you'll probably look at it and you'll see the way they're doing work and the way you've imagined it on a document is vastly different. So how do you make those changes, and how do you make it effective for the end user as well?
Yeah, I agree. All right, we're getting towards the end, so I might finish up with one question. No, I'll go with two. Let's go with the first one. Psychosocial risks. I always believe they've always been part of duty of care, but they've got a lot of attention recently. How do you see most companies or most organisations, how do you think they're going to manage formally psychosocial risks in the workplace?
That's a good one. The social psychology of risk, psychological safety, etc., it's an in thing now, and it's a common theme that's within the safety fraternity, for want of a better term. And I think it's got leverage and it's got legs as well through things like ISO 45003. Queensland are about to release a code of practice on mental health and wellbeing. And I think that we've got ISO standards around 45,000 for safety, it's 1,000 for environmental, 9,000 for quality. In time, I believe that something like 45,003 for psychosocial health will become another accreditation that companies are going to need to have as part of their tender. It's valid, but a lot of what you see with psychosocial risks, I think, is it's not always tangible. It's hard to see and touch. And if you went into companies' different investigation toolkits that they've got, where they hold the data, how many cases are you going to see where someone has put their hand up about stress or the psychological issues within the workplace? Well, I'd say it'd be zero. So we talk the story and we talk about mental health first aiders and wellbeing, mental health, that sort of thing, but are we really getting through? And by what we're going to do, is it tangible? Is it something that we can see and something we can touch? I'm not sure, but we need to keep on that journey. It's an important subject, and again, I think it's just important, and we need to look into it.
Yeah, look, it's one of those things. Is it a human resources issue? Is it a safety issue? Do we need human resources and safety to actually collaborate or work together on this? I'm not sure, let's be honest.
Absolutely, I believe so. I think human resources and the OH&S function, and that they need to be involved. And it can be outside of that as well. An example of I have in our workplace is I have an injury management wellbeing coordinator who is actually a registered nurse. And that person is able to bring some of the things they've learned from their nursing background into the workplace around mental health, that sort of thing. And similarly, human resources, they do all this homework around the people that are right for the job, that sort of things, that they need buy-in with us. So we're stakeholder engagement, and we're getting the right people in the right seats for the job. So it needs to be collaborative.
Yeah, I think so, because I look at, we seem to have a dearth of a shortage of health and safety advisors who are qualified and experienced, I'd suggest, at the moment. And trying to get someone with a certificate in health and safety to make an assessment on psychological safety, I don't know if they've necessarily going to have the skills that could be required.
I would agree. And the more ads, as an example for myself, when I put out for ads to get health and safety people or environmental people, one of the mandates I have now is tertiary qualified. I'm wanting to see either a Bachelor of Safety Science or a Bachelor of Environmental Science, or maybe a grad dip in OH&S. And I'm not disparaging the Cert 4 or the diploma in OH&S. They have their place. I just think if you're going to go down things like topics such as psychosocial health, you need someone who's be able to do their homework, can do the research, can base their findings on the science, and then can put something together again that makes sense for the end user. And I'm not sure you get that advantage through a Cert 4 or a diploma in OH&S.
Yeah, I agree with 100%. All right, finally, Keith, biggest challenge in health and safety Australia is facing, what do you think it is?
Probably leveraging off that topic we just talked about is sourcing the talent regarding the minimum standards for safety people or environmental people, whatever it's going to be. And for me, I like to get tertiary qualified. I know they bring something a bit broader and wider to the table. That's important. I do think the psychological safety, going forward, I believe that safety people need to be looking at some form of external study in psychology. Some of the books by Clive Lloyd around psychological safety all make sense. So I think if we can understand why the human brain does what it does, why humans do what they do, and their decision-making processes and the biases that come with that, that's important. So I guess it's around the talent pool that's out there, and then what are the extra things that come with it. Probably another one that does pop up just quickly is around the changing nature of legislation, particularly around codes of practice, that sort of thing. So, the respirable crystalline silica has been around for a while, but it's really getting some momentum now. In Queensland, the code of practice is about to come out. The regulator's hot on the foot with that one. Mental health, the code of practice comes out here in Queensland in May. So, what does that mean, and what are the audits and checklists that come with that, and how a company's going to be held accountable by the regulator to do things that they deem as best practice. So probably be my top three.
Okay, just before we go, you brought up something, and it just I kind of have to bring a question popped to mind anyhow. Harmonisation, and you're talking about Queensland government and other governments and codes of practice. How frustrating is it to you that we've gone from a system that ideally was same laws in each state and territory, and we seem to be breaking away from that now? Queensland's got codes of practice that are enforceable by law, other states don't. We seem to have different regulations coming in each state and territory. Does it frustrate you?
It does. I guess back in 2008, I think, was when they started talking about harmonisation, and then 2011 they got released, but then WA only jumped on board early last year, and Victoria have decided not to do it at all. So I wouldn't say it was a failure from the start, but if you couldn't get one of the states to get buy-in, well, where was it going to end? And I've seen the legislation keep changing continually across the different states. So it can be difficult when you work across different states and territories as well with the one company, because you would think that you're taking the health and safety legislation in Queensland will be the same in the Northern Territory, but it isn't necessarily the case. So you've still got to keep up to date with what's going on there. So I think it was a good intent at the time. It made sense. Harmonisation I thought was a good thing, but the byproduct of what we got now is we've gone full circle. We're sort of back where we started, but everyone's doing their own thing again. So I don't know, either we're throwing the toys out of the cot and just didn't understand it, or what's best practice look like going forward. That part I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, oh, excellent. Keith Johnson, thanks very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, thanks for your time, Tom. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, Keith.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Health and Safety Conversations with Tom Bourne. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week.